I'm Lorian Mariachi here at ACES 2018 for the Online News Association, University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. And with me is Lynne Murphy, our keynote speaker. Hello, Lynne, and welcome.
Hello, nice to be here.
Now, not only are you a keynote speaker here, but you've also written a book and you're a professor. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Sussex in Brighton, England. And I've written a book called The Prodigal Tongue, the love-hate relationship between American and British English, unless you live in Britain, in which case the subtitle is The Love-Hate Relationship Between British and American English. So I write a blog called Separated by a Common Language, where I talk about differences between British and American English, and that's led to the book.
Wonderful. Now, to be clear, you're an American.
I am an American.
And so you started here in America, and then you went over into Britain. And I'm wondering, what was it like? You were excited about some of the linguistic differences between the two. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, well, I'd lived in South Africa already, and so I knew a bit about living with another English. But when I moved to England, I study word meaning, and so in my day job, was doing things like looking at how children acquire opposites and stuff like that. But I kept being interested in my everyday experiences of not being understood or not understanding or noticing, subtle little differences between the way I talked and the way other people around me talked. So that led to the blog. And since then, because there's just so much to talk about, I've been doing a difference of the day on Twitter between British and American English for 9 years, every day, except weekends. I don't run out of material. There's just so much to look at. We mostly understand each other. We watch each other's TV and things like that. But there are just so many little differences in so many ways.
Now, you've been on tour promoting the book, so how long have you been in America?
I've been in for 3 months, or not for 3 months. I've been here for 1 month. It feels like 3 months. And so right now when you listen to me speak, I do not sound as British as I sounded when I first got here. I can definitely hear I've re-Americanized a lot. I don't sound British to British people, but when I come back to America, Americans say, "Oh, you're from England."
You fooled me. You did. I thought, and I had read in your bio that you're an American linguist in Britain, and then I was thinking, wow, a British woman who is studying American linguistics over there, and I was very interested in that, why that would happen, but then, no, it's an American linguist.
I think the thing is, because I tend to hit my T's hard, because I have to in England. So I say, better and water and things like that. I'm not saying it the same way as British people are saying it, but I'm hitting that T, and that's a big signal for Americans that somebody's English.
Okay.
Yeah.
I spent a little bit of time in England, and I was on a long train ride with 2 children, and I cannot say it with a British accent, and that's the whole point of the story. They were from Bath, and they were mocking me because we were on the train to Bath, and they were saying, "Where are we going? Where are we going?" And I was saying Bath, and they were just gales of giggles.
Yeah.
And they spent all of the hours of the train ride out to Bath trying to get me to be able to say it correctly, and I can't. I can bleat like a lamb, and I can say an American bath, but I can't get it out correctly.
But a funny thing about that is that we perceive Bath as being the British pronunciation, but that's really only used in the south of England, and Bath is in the south of England, so that's why that's relevant. But people from the north would say Bath too.
See, that makes me feel better. They just mocked me for the entire train ride, and at first it was kind of cute, and then it was a little endearing, and then it was a little irritating, because I couldn't do it. I could not round that A out. I just could not.
Well, that's my life. for 18 years.
Yeah, no, so I was going to ask about that with the, so you said you don't sound British to people from England. So even when you're over there and your accent is more British, so does that create any issues in like credibility as a linguist with not sounding like you have the native tongue?
I think when I first got there, I had a 75-year-old Royal Air Force retiree in my class, and I think he had a bit of a problem learning about the English language from a young Yank. He was charming, but I think he thought he wasn't getting what he deserved from an English university. But for the most part, I mean, my students, because they're young, they haven't quite developed that, oh, American English is bad view that a lot of older people in England have, which is just the standard reaction to language change. So, old people are always saying, oh, those young people, they're ruining our language. You get a lot of, oh, those Americans, they're ruining our language in Britain from middle-aged people who are noticing new words coming in. But the younger people, they're fine with Americans.
Now, we were talking a little bit recently about the young people's language and the new words that young people bring in that we, not quite as young people, ruin through usage. Are there any words in Britain that the young people are bringing in that's the new youth level slang?
There's a lot of youth slang in London, and I sort of don't even try anymore because I'm too old, and I will make it uncool if I ever say it. But one of the words that I learned from a student last year was "cotch," which means to crash at somebody's place, or a place to sleep. And she wrote a blog post about it for our departmental blog, and it was picked up by the British rapper Dizzy Rascal and tweeted to the world. And so that's our big claim to fame, is that we have a student who's attracted international attention for her work on that one word. But there's lots and lots of British youth slang. And the thing about it is it doesn't tend to come from America. It tends to grow right there.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the things that you talk about in the book is the mistakes, the mistaken assumptions that, this word or phrase is an Americanism and this one is a Britishism, and very often they are wrong.
Yes.
And so I think it's fascinating that there's this, all of this upset over this language exchange at the older levels, and then yet there's this purely British upswell of youth slang at the younger ages.
Well, I think that's because the older people aren't really aware of what's going on in the younger ages. That's not what they're reading in the newspapers. And so when they read the newspaper and they see an American word where, if they see that the Prime Minister met with Trump instead of met with him, or instead of met him, rather, that with will annoy them. They'll be, that's an Americanism that's come in and we've got to keep it out. But they're not listening to the youth. But I think this, it runs in cycles. When we get older, we start getting more like, that's not how to talk. That's not what they taught me in school. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the young people now who aren't bothered by American English, when new American English comes, maybe they'll be bothered.
And so one of the things we were talking about too was these rules and this, that's not how it goes, and that's not how we say that. And you were saying that in editing, that in America it's much more rigid as far as this is how things are to be said than it is in British English and with editing. And so would you like to talk about that?
Yeah. My book was published by two different publishers in the two different countries, so I was edited twice, and I'd heard about this, but I really got to experience it, that my British editor said, I trust you, I'm just going to make a few suggestions and see what we can do. And so, she just was sort of willing to let me have the phrases I had and go with it. The American editor made changes on every page. I mean, they had to because they had to change British spelling and British punctuation to American, but also she just caught so much stuff. One thing that I remember was the further, farther distinction, which nobody pays any attention to that in Britain, but she kept correcting it in my book. And I said, no, that needs to stay, because on my website for the book, I've got an index of all the Americanisms and Britishisms I use in the book. So I put that in as being a Britishism, to use further in that way. I can't even keep straight which one's which. But things like making the distinction between that and which in relative clauses, or making sure that you say try to rather than try and do something. Those are things that Americans are very conscious of, that just, it doesn't matter to the Brits. So, yeah, there's a lot more crossing out in American editing, I think.
And then do you feel that impacts then the relative languages? I mean, of course, both they're technically both English, but do you feel that impacts American English versus British English?
Well, Americans in some ways are more rule followers, and like to have rules spelt out. We've got a written constitution. Britain has an unwritten constitution. There's this whole tradition of different approaches to how you make rules. And so Americans have these long, big style books that spell all this stuff out, and you can see how those style books have affected the language. So for instance, the that which distinction, it comes from a British style book, comes from Fowler's, but the British just didn't pay any attention to it. But since that was published, the number of whiches in restrictive relative clauses in America has gone right down. Or Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, which nearly every university or college kid had to buy for decades. That says, use the active voice, don't use passive. And in America, the passive has just gone down, down, down in printed writing since the 60s at a much faster rate than it's gone down in British English. So Americans are reading those rules and they're applying them.
Yeah, I teach high school English, and I impress those rules on my children.
I was just reading a story yesterday by an American teacher who went to Britain, and he wanted to know more about British grammar. And so he went to a bookshop and said, can I buy a grammar book? And he said, the bookseller says, what do you mean, like for English as a second language? Because they don't have grammar books for native speakers. There are no grammar textbooks for college level English in Britain, but there are plenty. It's a very lucrative field in America. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of differences there.
Now, do you feel that it's impacted further than language? Do you feel it has had any impact on the relative cultures or the behaviors within the people?
I think it sort of goes the other way around. I think it's the cultures that affect the language. So it's that rule following, write down the rule and follow it culture in America that's led to that kind of thing. And you've got other things. So we were talking earlier about business speak and how that's something that in Britain is stereotyped as American, and for good reason. But that comes out of the culture of American business schools. We didn't have business schools in England until much, much later. And this notion of Americans of a can-do attitude and go-getting and doing stuff that is okay to put in language in America in a way that feels a little bit too pushy or too egotistical or something in Britain. So the vocabularies, I think, tend to follow the cultures. And then, of course, language helps make the culture continue in the way that it was. Yeah.
Now, I have so many questions about that, but I'm going to try. What are three, so you live this life of language, which for some of us is a phenomenal fantasy. What are three of your favorite things in your life in regards to this life of language?
Well, talking to people about it. I don't know, I have a hard time separating out things. It's just really, really lovely to have something that's all around you all the time that you can take joy in. you know, and I think a lot of people just take language for granted. I think it's really humbling to study language sort of in the depth that I do, because you assume you know what English is because you speak it. But then, you know, the more I've learned about English, even American English, about the English I speak, or about British English, it's just humbling to think how much I don't know, you know, and how much there is to find out. And so, yeah, I guess, you know, what I like is that I get to exercise curiosity all the time with something that's, it's not like being an oceanographer where you have to go to the sea to get anything done. I'm just in it all the time, and I love that.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynne.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming and talking with us today.
Thanks for having me.